Imagine being 8 years old, standing in the middle of a theater while bombs thunder overhead. The ceiling shakes, children scream, and soldiers grip their rifles as if the enemy might burst through the doors at any second. In the midst of panic, a tiny girl rises, her voice piercing through fear itself. That child was Petula Clark, and that single moment would not only silence a room under attack but set her on a path to conquer the world. Before we continue this journey into fire, fame, and shadows, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss stories of legends who rose from chaos. Born Sally Olwen Clark on November 15, 1932, in Surrey, England, Petula's childhood was not filled with playdates and lullabies. It was filled with sirens and rubble. She grew up during the Blitz, when London burned nightly under German bombs. Much of her early life unfolded in Abercynon, a mining village in Wales, where her grandfather clawed coal from the earth and carried the weight of darkness on his back. The contrast was brutal, underground tunnels suffocating with dust and danger on one side, and on the other, a child whose voice carried light into the blackest corners. By the time Petula was 7, she had already stood on stage at the Collier's Arms pub in Abercynon, her tiny frame trembling as she sang for miners hardened by soot and silence. Yet war soon devoured even those small joys. Nights became a race against death, her and her sister sprinting for air raid shelters while the skies above screamed with engines and explosions. Childhood wasn't stolen from Petula in a single moment. It was ground away night after night in shelters and shadows. It was during one of the darkest days of the war, inside the Criterion Theatre in London, that fate collided with fear. The BBC had gathered families for a broadcast meant to lift spirits, but the raid sirens wailed again, and the audience collapsed into panic. Children cried, adults whispered prayers, and the producers, desperate to salvage control, asked if anyone could perform. Petula stood up. Just 8 years old, with fear in her eyes but fire in her lungs, she began to sing Mighty Like a Rose. Her voice cut through the smoke of fear, silenced the weeping, and held the room hostage. It wasn't just music, it was defiance. When the last note lingered in the air, producers realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They recorded her. That moment marked the ignition point, the spark that would carry her through decades of both glory and torment. Once the BBC had discovered her voice, there was no turning back. The child who sang to soothe panic was now summoned again and again. By the mid-1940s, she was no longer simply Petula Clark. She had become the singing sweetheart. Soldiers carried her photographs inside tanks as talismans. Commanders invited her to perform for troops at camps, her voice rising against the roar of distant artillery. In total, she performed nearly 500 broadcasts during the war, her voice a constant reminder to weary men that home still existed, that life could still hold beauty amidst ruin. She even sang before King George VI, Winston Churchill, and Field Marshal Montgomery, figures who ruled the destiny of nations yet paused to hear the song of a child. But recognition carried a darker edge. While soldiers clung to her voice for comfort, Petula herself was losing her childhood, one performance at a time. Every broadcast tightened the chain. The war had made her indispensable, and in a world drowning in fear, her voice became a weapon as much as a gift. At a Kingston department store concert, long after midnight rehearsals and BBC broadcasts, Petula was paid not in pounds but in a tin of toffee and a gold wristwatch. Symbols of how little the world valued her youth, even as it consumed her. To many, it was charming, a little girl with a big voice receiving trinkets. To Petula, it was a reminder. Her gift was currency, and she could never turn back. The war that nearly shattered Britain had forged her into a performer before she even understood what performance meant. Her voice was no longer hers. It belonged to a nation clinging to survival. As the war dragged on, Petula's voice became less a child's gift and more a weapon Britain refused to let go of. The BBC called her back again and again, until the sheer number of performances blurred into exhaustion. What began as a single act of courage at the Criterion Theatre became nearly 500 appearances across broadcasts meant to keep soldiers steady. Each one pulled more of her childhood away. She wasn't just singing anymore, she was holding up a country's morale, filling silence with defiance while bombers droned overhead. Her payment was often symbolic rather than monetary. At one Kingston department store concert, she was handed a tin of toffee and a gold wristwatch. Small tokens that looked like rewards but felt like reminders that her innocence was a currency too easily traded. Britain adored her, but the adoration was suffocating. The golden voice they praised so dearly had become a chain around her neck, demanding she continue long after she should have been allowed to rest. When the film industry came calling, the weight only grew heavier. Director Maurice Elvey cast her in Medal for the General in 1944, where she played a 12-year-old orphan, a role that mirrored the vulnerability she often carried in her real life. From there, the camera refused to look away. She moved from set to set, Strawberry Roan, I Know Where I'm Going, London Town, and Here Come the Huggets, sharing scenes with names like Alec Guinness and Peter Ustinov. To the public, it was proof that she was versatile, that she was destined for greatness. But behind the lights, she was still a girl being pushed through endless corridors of expectation, a child working hours that would break grown men. The pressure seeped into every part of her life. She became a fixture not just on film but on radio, even appearing in the comic magazine Radio Fun as radio's merry mimic. Her image was everywhere, her smile polished, her talent exploited. And yet, in her heart, she was restless. The roles were repetitive, always the innocent, always the child. She wanted to break free, to step outside the cage of youthful sweetness that producers insisted she maintain. But war had already proven one thing. Once the machine of entertainment locked onto her, it would not let her go. Television opened another door, but it was one that led straight into deeper obligations. In 1946, she appeared on the BBC variety show Cabaret Cartoons. Her performance burned so brightly that the network offered her an entire series of her own. By 1950, she was hosting Pet's Parlor, a program that further tightened the public's grip on her. Britain now claimed her not only as their singing sweetheart but also as their household face, their daily comfort in the aftermath of war. Around this time, she met pianist Joe "Mr. Piano" Henderson, whose role in her life blurred between collaborator, partner, and controller. Their romance lasted nearly a decade, and while it gave her comfort, it also tethered her further to the machinery of fame. Through Henderson, she was introduced to producer Alan A. Freeman, and alongside her father, they created Polygon Records. For the first time, she had a label willing to record her own music. But freedom was an illusion. What looked like a step toward independence was simply another chapter in the relentless march forward. Her very first recording, Put Your Shoes on Lucy, carried a childlike innocence on the surface. But beneath it was the echo of a star who never got to choose when to grow up. Each duet, each recording session under Decca, wasn't a matter of readiness, it was necessity, the industry demanding more. The 1950s loomed ahead, promising opportunities but also sharpening the trap. Petula Clark was no longer just a girl with a golden voice. She was a product, shaped, packaged, and consumed by a world unwilling to let her breathe. The 1950s began with promise, but that promise came wrapped in barbed wire. Petula's early songs, light and playful on the surface, masked the grind behind them. The Little Shoemaker in 1954 became her first international hit, climbing to #1 in Australia and echoing across Europe. For the public, it was a charming success. For her, it was another lock on the cage. The music industry no longer saw her as a child breaking free. It saw her as a factory for hits, a product that had to keep producing or risk being discarded. Polygon Records, the small family-run label that had carried her beginnings, couldn't hold against the tidal force of the industry. By 1955, it was swallowed by Nixa, and soon after by Pi Records. Overnight, Petula found herself tied to a contract that owned her voice for nearly 2 decades. Every note she sang, every breath she gave to a song, was no longer hers, it belonged to the company. Pi Records squeezed her golden years dry, feeding on her talent while the world clapped for more. The charm of independence had been crushed, and she stood in its place as both star and prisoner. The hits kept coming, each one heavier than the last. Suddenly There's a Valley in 1955, With All My Heart in 1956, songs that seemed to float effortlessly from radios but cost her fragments of her youth. By the early 1960s, her schedule was relentless, recording, touring, appearing on television, all while the shadow of exhaustion grew larger. The more successful she became, the deeper the claws of the industry sank into her. Every performance was praised, but behind her smile was the constant reminder that she wasn't living for herself anymore. She was living for the demands of others. Then came Europe, a new frontier that both expanded her empire and magnified the weight she carried. In 1957, she stepped onto the stage at the Paris Olympia, terrified of failure, her body fighting both nerves and illness. Success that night chained her tighter to the European stage, and almost immediately she was introduced to Vogue Records, where she would meet Claude Wolff, the man who would become both her husband and manager. What looked like love was also strategy, binding her personal and professional life into a single, inescapable contract. From that moment on, her career and her marriage became indistinguishable, one fueling the other, one feeding on the other. In France, she reinvented herself. She recorded in French, German, Italian, and Spanish, her voice bent and reshaped to fit every market that demanded her. To fans, it was versatility. To Petula, it was survival. Each language fractured her identity further, until the young girl who had once stood trembling in bomb shelters seemed to disappear under layers of carefully manufactured personas. She smiled for the crowds, toured with Sacha Distel, and produced hit after hit, but behind the glamour was fatigue, the weariness of a woman carrying not just the expectations of Britain but the hunger of entire countries. The British market clawed at her still. In 1961, her single Sailor hit #1, and Romeo sold over 1 million copies, earning her a gold disc from the Recording Industry Association of America. Each victory only heightened the pressure. Every hit became proof she had to deliver another. Each round of applause became a demand for more. And the world kept consuming. France crowned her with Ya Ya Twist, the only female-led twist song to storm the charts. Then came Chariot, later translated into English as I Will Follow Him, a song that tore across Europe and embedded itself into the fabric of pop culture. Even Jacques Brel and Serge Gainsbourg fed her their songs, voices of French artistry finding in Petula a vessel strong enough to carry their poetry. To the world, she seemed unstoppable, her star rising higher with each release. But the truth was darker. She was running on borrowed time, each step deeper into the machine, each hit a reminder that escape was impossible. The trap had been sprung, and though her voice soared, her freedom had already been sold. By the early 1960s, there were whispers that Petula's reign might be slowing. Britain, which had once clung to her every note, seemed restless, and her recordings lacked the fire that once defined them. For a moment, it felt as though the machine might release her. Then Tony Hatch arrived in Paris, clutching fragments of a tune he had scribbled in New York. He played it for her, uncertain, and she, weary but instinctive, claimed it. That half-finished idea became Downtown. No one, least of all Petula, understood the storm it was about to unleash. Released in late 1964, Downtown didn't just chart, it consumed. It tore through the United Kingdom, then France, then leapt across oceans. By the start of 1965, Warner Brothers had secured the U.S. rights, and within weeks the single had climbed to #1 on the American Billboard chart, selling over 3 million copies. Suddenly, Petula was no longer just Europe's jewel. She was an international titan, carrying a Grammy Award in one hand and the hollow, glittering crown of superstardom in the other. The song was more than a hit, it was a rebirth, but one that bound her identity forever to a title she could never escape: global superstar. With Downtown came a relentless flood. I know a place, my love, a sign of the times, don't sleep in the subway, I couldn't live without your love, this is my song, each one stacking higher on her shoulders, cementing her legend but chaining her to an endless cycle of expectation. My Love became her second American #1, while Downtown was eventually enshrined in the Grammy Hall of Fame. To the world, she was radiant on stage, smiling beneath the lights, her voice flawless. But every stage, every award, every applause was another reminder that she no longer owned herself. She belonged to the public, piece by piece. Her presence on American television sealed her image. She became a fixture on The Ed Sullivan Show, The Dean Martin Show, Shindig, and The Hollywood Palace. The charm seemed effortless, her voice immaculate, her smile unbreakable. Yet behind the cameras, the truth was darker. The spotlight was no longer warm, it was blinding. The demand for perfection left no room for vulnerability, no space for silence. The girl who had once sung to calm frightened children in a bomb shelter was now performing to soothe a different kind of fear, the fear of irrelevance. Then came 1968, the year when her career collided head-on with America's cultural divide. NBC had invited her to host a television special. Among her chosen guests was Harry Belafonte, and together they performed a raw, aching anti-war hymn titled On the Path of Glory. In the middle of the performance, moved by the emotion of the song, Petula reached out and placed her hand on Belafonte's arm. It was a gesture of unity, of empathy, of defiance against the hatred splitting the country apart. But to the corporate eyes behind the cameras, it was poison. The sponsor panicked, terrified of Southern backlash at the sight of a white woman touching a black man on primetime television. He demanded that the moment be erased, that the scene be red-hot, that the danger be buried beneath something safe. Petula and her husband Claude refused. They destroyed every alternate take, leaving only the unedited cut, the one with the forbidden touch. There would be no compromise, no retreat. The sponsor lost his job, and the broadcast went out just 4 days after Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered, a nation trembling between grief and rage. The performance shattered ratings, critics praised its audacity, and history carved her name into the story of that night. Petula Clark was no longer just a singer. She had become a figure unafraid to ignite fire on stage, a woman willing to risk everything to stand against prejudice. The storm of fame raged on. Films beckoned, theaters opened their doors, and the spotlight never dimmed. Yet with every success came shadows that lengthened behind her, reminding her that her voice was no longer just music, it was power, rebellion, and sacrifice. And power always came with a price. The late 1960s and early 1970s were years when Petula no longer stood simply as a pop singer but as a woman constantly battling to prove she could survive in a world that consumed its stars. After Downtown, the machine of fame demanded she expand beyond music, and she stepped into cinema with a mix of courage and defiance. In 1968, she shared the screen with Fred Astaire in Finian's Rainbow. Her performance earned her a Golden Globe nomination, but behind the glamour of the red carpets was the reality of endless rehearsals, brutal schedules, and the weight of standing beside a Hollywood legend. A year later, she starred with Peter O'Toole in Goodbye, Mr. Chips, her reputation as a serious actress confirmed. To the audience, it was triumph. To Petula, it was another battlefield won in a war that had no end. Off the screen, she continued to dominate the live circuit. Supper clubs in New York and Los Angeles clamored for her presence. She filled the Copacabana, the Coconut Grove, and other legendary venues with crowds that demanded perfection every night. But success never came without shadows. In Montreal in 1969, as she moved seamlessly between English and French during a performance, hecklers spat their contempt from the darkened crowd. Their hatred shook her, and for the first time in years, she felt the fragility of her own voice against the noise of prejudice. Unsure how to proceed, she turned to John Lennon for advice and soon found herself swept into one of the most iconic protests of the era, the Bed-In for Peace. There she stood with Lennon and Yoko Ono, her voice woven into the anthem Give Peace a Chance. History would again claim her, placing her at the center of a moment when art and activism collided. The milestones did not stop. On November 15, 1969, her concert An Evening with Petula became the BBC's first-ever color broadcast, sealing her place in television history. She had crossed from radio sweetheart to global superstar, from child prodigy to defiant icon. Yet even as she blazed new trails, she carried the cost on her shoulders. Each innovation was another layer of exhaustion, each triumph another reminder that she was trapped in an endless cycle of giving herself away. By the 1970s, the pace shifted, but only slightly. Singles like Melody Man, The Song of My Life, and Loving Arms marked the decade, but she chose to narrow her focus toward family and more selective projects. Still, the stage never released her. In 1981, she stormed London's West End in The Sound of Music, taking on the role of Maria Von Trapp. Audiences flooded the theater in record numbers. Critics praised her conviction, and Maria herself declared Petula the finest to ever play her part. The production earned Petula an Olivier Award nomination, solidifying her dominance not just in pop and film but in theater as well. It was a reminder that even when she pulled back, the world found ways to drag her forward. Her career had stretched across languages, genres, and decades, each turn proving her resilience. She had sung for soldiers in the trenches of war, defied sponsors on live television, held her own against Hollywood's brightest names, and survived the ruthless grip of record companies that consumed talent like fuel. Behind every smile was fatigue, behind every award was sacrifice, and behind every performance was a woman who had given up pieces of herself to keep the world entertained. And yet, even into her later years, she refused to stop. Into her 80s and beyond, she toured the United States, sometimes sleeping on a tour bus, her voice still carrying the same fire that once silenced bomb shelters. When asked why, she answered simply, because she loved it. Because the stage, for all its shadows, was also the place where she felt most alive. By 92, she was still planning concerts with full orchestras, still teasing the world with promises of more. Her story is not one of gentle stardom, but of survival. She was forged in fire, shaped by war, and bound by the chains of fame, yet she never surrendered. From frightened child to global icon, she endured every demand, every storm, every shadow. Her voice had belonged to the world for more than 8 decades, and even now it refuses to fade. Petula Clark's legacy is proof that some stars are not consumed by the darkness, they are born from it. And if this story left you captivated, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because here, we bring you the untold stories, the darker truths, and the battles behind the legends. You won't want to miss what comes next.